Journey through the sands of time to where civilization began. This is the enduring legacy of Jericho.
Jericho's secrets lie buried beneath these ancient sands.
Technology now reveals the city as it once stood.
These fortifications were once thought to be impenetrable.
In an instant, the great walls came tumbling down.
By the 15th century before Christ, Jericho was the oldest city in the known world and one of the most heavily fortified in all the land of Canaan. An oasis nestled at the lowest point on the surface of the earth, fed by a spring that flowed without ceasing at the foot of an artificial hill shaped by thousands of years of human occupation. Date palms, freshly harvested barley fields, and the scent of balsam filled a valley that stood in brutal contrast to the desert surrounding it. Within its walls, a population of several thousand people lived, traded, and worshipped their gods, unaware that this would be their last spring. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, maps, and ancient engravings to life, shifting perspective, adjusting camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original creators never could have imagined. The goal isn't just to look at the past, but to step into it, to walk through Jericho as it once was, and try to imagine what it must have felt like to stand there at the precise moment when everything changed. And if you stick around until the end, we'll compare these same locations to how they look today, to see what time has changed and what still remains. Before we set foot inside the walls of Jericho, it helps to understand why this city existed in the first place. The Jordan Valley is one of the deepest depressions on the planet, a geological rift that descends hundreds of meters below sea level. In the middle of that arid, sun-scorched landscape, a spring called Ain es-Sultan gushed with a generous flow of fresh, clear water, creating around it an oasis of fertility that was almost unthinkable. The first settlers arrived more than 10,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest permanent human settlements in history. By the time we are looking at, generations of inhabitants had built their homes one on top of another, creating a raised mound that dominated the surrounding plain. Jericho was not just ancient, it was almost eternal. The city sat in a formidable strategic position. From this point, three major trade routes branched out into the highlands of Canaan, one heading north toward Bethel and Shechem, another west toward Jerusalem, and a third south toward Hebron. Anyone wishing to access the mountainous heartland of the region had to pass through here. This made Jericho not just an agricultural oasis, but a gateway, a control point that any invading force needed to take before advancing into the interior. Caravans arriving from the east, crossing the fords of the Jordan River, found here their first stop, a place where water was plentiful and trade flourished among palm trees and irrigated fields. The city's defensive system was imposing for its size. At the base of the mound stood a retaining wall built of stone, rising several meters above the surrounding terrain. On top of this first wall rested a thick barrier of sun-dried mud bricks, tall enough to make any attacker stop and reconsider. A steep embankment connected this outer wall to a second line of defense at the crest of the mound, where another mud brick wall protected the upper city. Between both lines of defense, along the embankment, people also lived, many of whom had built their homes directly against the walls. It was a city small in area, perhaps only a few hectares, but densely populated and shielded by a system that, seen from the plains below, must have looked nearly impregnable. Inside the walls, Canaanite life followed the rhythm of the seasons and of commerce. The inhabitants stored grain in large ceramic jars within their homes, enough to withstand a prolonged siege if necessary. The spring lay within the defensive perimeter, which meant the water supply was secure even under attack. The barley harvest had just been gathered, and flax stalks were spread drying on the flat rooftops of the houses. an everyday detail that would later take on unexpected significance in the biblical account. The people of Jericho worshipped fertility gods, and some researchers believe the city's very name may derive from Yarek, the Canaanite word for moon, or from the lunar deity Yarik, whose cult had one of its oldest centers here. From the other side of the Jordan, a nomadic people watched the city with a mixture of fear and determination. According to the account in the book of Joshua, the Israelites had arrived at the plains of Moab after 40 years of wandering through the desert, and Jericho was the first obstacle standing between them and the land that had been promised to them. Before crossing the river, Joshua sent 2 spies to scout the city and assess its defenses. The men crossed into enemy territory and found shelter in the house of a woman named Rahab, whose dwelling was built directly against the outer wall in the lower part of the city. Rahab hid them beneath the bundles of flax she was drying on her rooftop, just in time before soldiers from the king of Jericho arrived searching for them. What Rahab told the spies reveals something about the mood inside the city. She confessed that the inhabitants had heard how the God of Israel had parted the waters of the sea to lead his people out of Egypt, and how they had defeated the Amorite kings on the other side of the Jordan. Fear had taken hold of Jericho. In exchange for her protection, she asked that when the Israelites took the city, her family would be spared. The spies accepted the pact and told her to hang a scarlet cord from her window as a sign so their soldiers could identify her house during the attack. Rahab helped them descend through the window that opened onto the outer side of the wall, and the men fled toward the mountains before returning to the Israelite camp with a report that summed up the situation in a single idea. The city was terrified. Imagine being one of the inhabitants of Jericho in those days. The city gates had been shut. No one was going in or out. From the top of the walls, you could see the Israelite camp across the plain. And every morning for 6 consecutive days, something bewildering took place. A silent procession of armed men circled the city, preceded by priests carrying a golden ark and blowing ram's horns. They completed 1 full circuit around the walls and then withdrew without attacking, without shouting, without attempting to scale anything. Only the sound of the horns and the dust their footsteps raised. It must have been an unsettling experience, a form of psychological warfare unlike anything the defenders had ever seen. The 7th day was different. Instead of circling once, the procession went around the city 7 times. At the end of the 7th circuit, the horns sounded with a different intensity, and a collective shout rose from the Israelite ranks. What happened next is one of the most celebrated moments in biblical narrative. The walls of Jericho fell. They were not breached from outside or undermined from below. Instead, according to the original Hebrew text, they collapsed beneath themselves, a description suggesting that the bricks of the upper wall crumbled down to the base, forming a ramp of rubble that allowed the attackers to climb straight into the city. Every man charged straight ahead, and the city was taken. What archaeologists found at the site confirms several of these details with remarkable precision. In excavations carried out during the 20th century, both John Garstang in the 1930s and Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s discovered that the mud bricks of the wall had indeed fallen outward, piling up at the foot of the stone retaining wall and forming a kind of inclined ramp. This is unusual because in most besieged cities, walls are knocked inward by attackers. Here, the collapse went from inside to outside, which is more consistent with an earthquake or some event that affected the foundations simultaneously around the entire circumference. Curiously, a section of wall on the north side of the city remained standing, and it had houses built against it, a detail that matches the described location of Rahab's house. Beneath the rubble and above it, archaeologists found a layer of ash and destruction nearly 3 feet thick. The walls and floors of the rooms were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, charred timbers, and household utensils. The destruction was total, exactly as the biblical account describes when it states that the Israelites burned the entire city and everything in it. But perhaps the most revealing find was the large jars of grain discovered intact inside the houses. In any prolonged siege, food reserves would have been consumed by the defenders. The fact that the grain was still there indicates the siege was extraordinarily brief, which matches the 7 days described in the text. The exact dating of this destruction has been the subject of one of the longest-running archaeological debates of the past century. Kenyon initially attributed the fall of the city to an earlier date, around 1550 before Christ, linking it to Egyptian campaigns against the Hyksos. However, a later analysis of the pottery carried out by archaeologist Bryant Wood in the 1990s suggested that the destruction corresponded to the late Bronze Age, around 1400 before Christ, which would align with the biblical chronology of the conquest. Egyptian scarabs found in nearby tombs, including one from Pharaoh Amenhotep III, support this later date. The debate continues among specialists, but what is not disputed is that the city was indeed destroyed by fire following the collapse of its walls, under circumstances that align with multiple details from the account in Joshua. Beyond the archaeology and beyond faith, there is something deeply human about this story. Jericho was not just a fortress or a symbol, it was a home. The jars of grain found inside the houses belonged to families who had filled them after the harvest, expecting that food to sustain them for months. The looms, the grinding tools, the kitchen utensils scattered among the rubble are the remains of everyday lives interrupted abruptly. There were children playing in the narrow streets between the two walls, merchants haggling over prices in the shade of the palm trees, and women spreading flax across rooftops while watching the horizon with growing unease. For them, Jericho was not an epic tale, but simply their world, the only one they knew. And in the midst of all of that stood Rahab, a woman who lived on the margins of her own society, in a house pressed against the outer wall. In the most vulnerable part of the city, her decision to hide the spies was not simply an act of treason against her king. It was a bet on survival based on a conviction her own neighbors did not share. When the walls fell around her and fire consumed every corner of Jericho, her house remained standing. Archaeologists found exactly that. A section of wall intact on the north side, with houses built against it, preserved while everything else collapsed. The scarlet cord in the window, if it truly existed, must have been one of the last colors visible before the flames turned everything to black. After the destruction, Joshua pronounced a curse on anyone who would attempt to rebuild Jericho. And indeed, the city remained abandoned for centuries. The mound of rubble lay exposed to the desert wind and sun, gathering dust over the ashes of the last Canaanite city. It was not until much later, during the Iron Age, that a small population settled in the area again.
Fire consumed what
By
the earth
then,
had already broken,
the walls that had
leaving
once
only
sheltered
ash as a witness
thousands
to the end.
were nothing more than a memory buried beneath meters of earth. Now, I want to bring you into the present and show you how these places look today. Thanks for being here, and if you have thoughts or requests for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's get into it. The mound, known as Tel es Sultan, rises today above the plain of the Jordan Valley as a compacted earthen hill, just over a kilometer north of modern Jericho. At first glance, it looks like little more than an uneven stretch of terrain dotted with archaeological trenches, but beneath that surface lie more than 10,000 years of human history. In 2023, UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, recognizing it as the oldest fortified city in the world. The spring of Ain Sultan, the same source that gave life to Canaanite Jericho, still flows beside the mound, Its water remains plentiful and clear, feeding irrigation channels that keep the oasis surrounding the modern city green. The desert spring that attracted the first hunter-gatherers more than 12,000 years ago continues to do exactly the same thing: sustain life in one of the most inhospitable spots on the planet. From the top of Tel Es Sultan, looking east, you can see the broad plain of the Jordan stretching toward the river, and beyond it, the mountains of Moab, where Moses gazed upon the promised land without being able to enter it. The landscape is strikingly similar to what the defenders of Jericho would have seen from the top of their walls, an arid valley ringed by brown hills, broken only by the green strip of the oasis. The Neolithic Tower of Jericho, uncovered by Kenyon in the 1950s, remains visible in one of the excavation trenches. Standing over 8 meters tall, with an internal staircase of 22 steps, it was for millennia the tallest structure ever built by human hands until the pyramids of Egypt surpassed it. Seeing it today, exposed to the open air after millennia of burial, is a reminder that the human drive to build upward began here. The remains of the stone retaining wall, upon which the mud brick walls that fell before Joshua once stood, can be partially seen in the excavated sections of the mound. The mud bricks that once formed a barrier several meters thick are now little more than an uneven line in the stratigraphic profile of the terrain. But their presence confirms what multiple archaeological expeditions documented over the past century. West of Tel Es Sultan rises the Mount of Temptation, where, according to Christian tradition, Jesus fasted for 40 days. A Greek Orthodox monastery clings to the cliff face, accessible today by a cable car that offers panoramic views of the valley. From up there, you can understand the geography of this story with a clarity that maps cannot provide. The Jordan winding toward the Dead Sea, the plain where the Israelites camped, and the small mound that was once the gateway to Canaan. Modern Jericho spreads south of the archaeological site, a city of some 20,000 inhabitants, still known for its palm trees and tropical climate. It is still called the City of Palms, the same name the Bible gave it more than 3,000 years ago. Bananas have partly replaced the date palms, and the irrigated fields now yield different crops, but the essence of the oasis has not changed. A few kilometers to the south, Hisham's Palace preserves one of the largest mosaics in the Middle East, the celebrated Tree of Life, restored in recent years and open to the public. And a little farther east, the hypersaline waters of the Dead Sea continue to evaporate under a relentless sun, in the same extreme landscape that surrounded Jericho when its walls were still standing. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input, and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.